Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of NOUS, the podcast where I tackle the deepest questions about the mind. Each episode features a conversation with a cutting-edge thinker with a big idea. They might be working in philosophy, or neuroscience, or psychiatry, or they could be working across several disciplines. What matters is that they have a profound and stimulating idea to share. So it seemed fitting to kick off the whole series by tackling perhaps the deepest and most intractable question of all. How can we explain consciousness? How can a squishy mass of brain cells and body parts give rise to feeling and seeing? As one philosopher memorably put it, trying to figure out how the brain produces consciousness is like trying to get numbers from biscuits or ethics from rhubarb. It can seem impossible. But my guest today believes he has an answer. It's a bizarre idea, but also kind of beautiful. And it's called Panpsychism. If he's right, it means that the universe is maybe filled with consciousness. Here to blow my mind is philosopher and assistant professor at the University of Durham, Dr. Philip Goff. Philip, welcome to NOUS.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So first off, I think congratulations are in order. I believe you handed in almost the final version of your manuscript for a book on panpsychism just yesterday.
That's right, yeah. That was a great relief, and I finally got it off, and then they sent it me back a few hours later with just some small suggestions, but pretty much done. So that's a big relief.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that they commissioned you to write this for a popular audience it seems to be testament to maybe an upsurge of interest in panpsychism, a particular sort of momentum behind it at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess also the more general problem of consciousness, I think this is very, very much in the public mind. I think, consciousness used to be a very much a taboo topic. I think largely due to the work of David Chalmers in the 1990s with this famous phrase, the hard problem of consciousness, has really got in the public mind the consciousness as a scientific issue. Just in the last 10 to 15 years, I think panpsychism has gone from being something that was laughed at insofar as it was thought of at all, to being taken very seriously in academic philosophy and in neuroscience as well, to an extent, I think.
I mean, and you're certainly one of the people at the forefront of bringing it back into fashion, I guess you could say. If that makes it sound rather fickle, I'm guessing you'd want to say there's more to it than fashion.
Yeah, I mean, one of the main reasons it's come to prominence again in academic philosophy is that something we might talk about, the rediscovery of certain ideas from the 1920s of Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, and the scientist Arthur Eddington. I'm inclined to think these guys, it's a bit of a bold statement maybe, but I'm inclined to think these guys did for consciousness science in the 1920s what Darwin did for the science of life. But it subsequently got forgotten about for a long time for various reasons, like the Second World War and the sort of anti-philosophy zeitgeist of the latter war years. But it's recently been rediscovered in academic philosophy, causing a great excitement as a possible way forward on consciousness.
Well, that's certainly an exciting idea that Russell and Eddington are the lost Darwins of consciousness studies that have just been rediscovered. So before we go into the sort of details of their ideas that got forgotten, should we just get an idea of how you would define panpsychism? What is it?
I define panpsychism as the view that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical world. So on a standard interpretation of panpsychism, the basic constituents of the physical world, perhaps electrons or quarks, have unimaginably simple forms of experience. And then the very complex and rich consciousness of the human animal brain is somehow derived from the consciousness of its most basic parts. So that's the basic idea. It sounds a bit crazy, but I think an increasing number of philosophers and some neuroscientists are starting to think it might be our best hope for making progress on the problem of consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound crazy. The idea that electrons have some kind of experience it is wildly counterintuitive, I think. But what I find exciting is trying to understand what gets you to that conclusion.
Yeah.
And I think, well, let's see if we can explore the sort of route that you've been on. Perhaps let's just, biographically speaking, you've been working on the question of consciousness for many years, right from the beginning of your academic career, or?
Absolutely. Yes, I think I've been obsessed with the problem of consciousness as far back as I can remember, really. And when I was a philosophy undergraduate, we were taught that the only two options on consciousness were, on the one hand, materialism, where you kind of think consciousness somehow arises from the chemistry of the brain, or on the other hand, dualism, where you think consciousness is completely outside of the physical workings of the body and brain. And as time went on, just even as an undergraduate, I just came to see both of these options pretty implausible. I actually finished my undergraduate degree. I wrote my end of studies dissertation arguing that the problem of consciousness was just irresolvable, because I thought these were the only two options and they were just both hopeless. And so I became quite disillusioned, actually, and I thought I had enough of philosophy and went off and taught English as a foreign language in Poland. But then I eventually came across this third way, as it were, panpsychism, that, it sounds like a crazy view, but it seems to avoid the deep difficulties that I think face both materialism on the one hand and dualism on the other. I think I'd probably sell it as in the way Churchill sold democracy, that I think panpsychism is the worst solution to the problem of consciousness apart from all the others. So I think it's what it offers us is a way of integrating consciousness into our scientific picture of the world in a way that avoids the deep problems that beset more conventional options.
Okay, so you were disillusioned as an undergraduate, thinking that the problem of consciousness was completely unsolvable, and stuck between the sort of the two options, really: physicalism, that everything in the universe is just physical stuff, that there is nothing more than physical stuff, and dualism, the idea that the mind somehow floats free, and now both of those are beset by terrible problems. I mean, I think at the moment, are there many people still who are dualists?
Yeah, I'd say it's a respectable minority position. David Chalmers, probably most notably, Martina Niederrümelin, who's a very good philosopher. And you see, so contemporary dualists would tend to call themselves, David Chalmers calls himself a naturalistic dualist. So, traditionally we think of dualism as belief in the soul, and that's outside of the domain of science. But naturalistic dualists like Chalmers want to say, no, it's a natural phenomenon. It's not physical, but it's a natural phenomenon governed by natural laws. So, yeah, I mean, I think there are big problems with this view. I think it's a respectable
interesting because
minority.
that doesn't sound like the kind of that doesn't sound like the kind of Descartes kind of dualism that I'm familiar with from university undergraduate days.
Right.
So David Chalmers says it's naturalistic, but he's a naturalist dualist.
So the idea would be, consciousness arises from the physical processes of the brain. And when you first hear that, you think, well, that's materialism, isn't it? People think consciousness is the view that the brain produces consciousness. But actually, that's not materialism, because if the brain produced consciousness, then consciousness would be something extra to the brain. Like, my parents produced me. I'm something different and distinct from my parents. So the materialist view tends to be, no, feelings and experiences are identical with, or one and the same thing as the electrochemical processes in your brain. They're not caused by it, they're identical with it. So in Chalmers' view, consciousness is caused by the brain, but the brain only manages to do that because of special psychophysical laws of nature. So Chalmers thinks that as well as the laws of physics, if you just had the laws of physics alone, you wouldn't have consciousness. Brains would not produce consciousness. You just have zombies, as physical duplicates of us that have no consciousness at all, just complicated mechanisms. Right. But because of these special psychophysical laws that Chalmers postulates over and above the laws of physics, in virtue of these laws, brain processes of the right kind produce conscious experience.
I'm sort of interested in this, but I probably shouldn't dwell on this because there's a lot of other things to get through. But I'm just curious to know what this kind of law would look like. It would be, in the case of certain physical structures and processes, then psychological properties exist.
Yeah.
Is that the kind of law we're talking about?
Yeah. And, it might go the other way around as well, because presumably, and this is where we get into the problems of dualism, most dualists would want to say, not only does the brain produce consciousness, but consciousness can impact back. Your conscious thoughts can cause your actions, your conscious decision to raise your arm can move your arm up. So it might be laws in two directions, and this is where we start to get into the problems of dualism, because I kind of think the problems of materialism are of a philosophical nature, whereas the problems of dualism are more of a scientific nature. My basic worry is, if there was non-physical consciousness impacting on the brain every second of waking life, then that would really show up in our neuroscience. There'd be all sorts of things happening in the brain that had no physical explanation. So it would be like a poltergeist was playing with the brain. And so I think that would really show up in our neuroscience, and it doesn't seem to. And so the fact that we don't seem to find these anomalous events in the brain with no physical explanation, I think gives us very strong reason to think dualism is false.
Okay, so absolutely, you think, and I think I would say it's a fairly widespread consensus that dualism just doesn't work because of this problem of interaction. This question of how does the non-physical bit that constitutes the mind somehow interact with the brain and the body?
Right. Yeah.
That's the major problem, right? For dualism.
Yeah, and I guess in the old days, people used to think of it more as trying to make that connection intelligible. The connection between something utterly non-physical and the physical brain. I think, as I say, the problem that's taken more seriously now is just more an empirical one, is there doesn't seem to be any sign in the brain of the impact of a non-physical mind. It's really a more observational thing rather than this philosophical question of intelligibility.
So is that idea, when you were looking at people's brains, maybe doing brain scans or something would show up, as in things would be caused, stuff would happen in the brain that had no physical explanation.
Right.
Is that the sort of idea?
That's the thought. Yeah, it'd be gappy, as it were. Just as, an analogy I give in my new forthcoming book. Imagine if God regularly miraculously cured disease. Obviously it's slightly controversial whether there are, but it doesn't happen very regularly. But suppose it happened all the time, and doctors would find, limbs growing back and tumors healing, and this would just be happening all the time. And that would be, if that were the case, that would be very strong evidence. So if dualism were true, you'd expect something similar. In fact, you'd expect it to be even more frequent, because the mind is causing behavior all the time. So you'd expect all of these, just as a non-physical deity interacting with a physical world would make itself shown, so a non-physical mind interacting with the physical brain would show a sign of its presence, and we don't seem to find that. So maybe we just keep missing it, but the longer this goes on, the less plausible dualism seems.
Okay, so dualism's no good, in your view. The other option is physicalism. Now, I think that's a more widely held view.
Yeah, a recent survey from Phil Papers said, I think it was 56% of philosophers are now materialists. So it's a majority, but only just. It used to be a time where no challenge to materialism or physicalism was tolerated. You couldn't get published. I probably wouldn't have had a job if 30 years ago. But it's still the majority, but less so.
56%.
It's like Brexit.
Yeah.
No, that's it. It's a little bit.
In terms of, getting a lot of philosophers in a room and finding 56% of them agree, that's quite surprising to me.
Yeah. I don't know. I think consensus in philosophy is, I mean, compared to economics, for example, or other social sciences, I think there are points in philosophy where there's a fair amount of consensus. Yeah, it's still the majority position, materialism, physicalism, I'd say.
Okay, so let's explore why you think it's wrong.
Right. I mean, the core of the difficulty, it's a complicated debate, but I think the core of the difficulty is that physical science works with a purely quantitative vocabulary, whereas consciousness is an essentially qualitative phenomenon, simply in the sense that it involves qualities. If you think about the redness of a red experience, or the smell of coffee, or the taste of chocolate, you can't capture these kind of qualities in the purely quantitative vocabulary of physical science.
Okay, so can we just perhaps explore the taste of chocolate? Presumably, science can tell us lots of interesting things about the taste of chocolate, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to say that physical science, such as neuroscience, has no role to play. Obviously, it plays a crucial role. I'm an absolutely huge fan of neuroscience, and I try to stay as up to date as possible on developments. The claim would be that physical science. So, what does physical science do? What do I mean by a purely quantitative vocabulary? I mean, really, this starts with Galileo. Galileo declares that the new mathematics is to be the language of the new science. What he called natural philosophy, what we now call physical science. So since then, physical science has worked with a purely quantitative vocabulary, by which I mean a vocabulary that involves just mathematical and causal concepts. And I think this is great for capturing behavior, for generating mathematical models that can capture the behavior of matter. And, and this is incredibly useful information. If you can predict the behavior of matter, then you can manipulate the natural world in all sorts of extraordinary ways. And this is what yields amazing technology.
Can we just explore that, though, with on the taste of chocolate? So presumably, a biochemist could tell us something about the chemical structure of chocolate, or of the, what tastes like chocolate, and the effect that has on the taste receptors, and then the sort of patterns of electrical signals that pass to the brain.
Yeah.
Is all this quantitative?
Yeah. Yeah, so there's certainly a rich amount of information, such as you've described. Let's think about colours. I think what you can do with a purely quantitative vocabulary is describe structural relationships between different colours, right? You could say in terms of hue, lightness, saturation, you can describe similarities, you can put colours together in a network in terms of their similarities and differences. But what you cannot do with a purely quantitative vocabulary is to communicate to someone what it's like to see colors, right? A neuroscientist who's been blind since birth, no matter how much neuroscience they learn, they will never know what it's like to see red. There's actually a very interesting philosophy article on these kind of arguments by Nut Norby, I think his name is. Okay. I talk about this in my book as well, who's a color expert who's never who has some cones missing from his eyes, so he can only see black and white and shades of grey.
Oh my goodness.
So it's a great example, because it's in the philosophical literature. We have this character Mary, who's a brilliant neuroscientist who knows everything there is to know about the neuroscience of seeing colours, but she's been raised in this black and white room where she's only ever seen black and white and shades of grey. And Nut Nordby is kind of Mary, the living Mary. And so he talks about, the sense he makes of colours. And he says, well, I think of it a little bit like sounds. And I know of structural analogies between sounds and colours. But that gives me a kind of abstract template. I can never know what it's like to see colour. So
Nut Norby agrees, I guess, then, with this thought experiment.
He sort of shies away a little bit from challenging materialism, but he does go so far as to say he thinks Mary, this character, when she comes out of her room, and if she sees colours for the first time, she wouldn't be able to identify them. And I think you can draw implications from that. But to come back to the thought experiment, the idea is Mary learns all the neuroscience, all the quantitative information in her black and white room. But then she comes out of the room, she sees a bright red rose, and the thought is that she learns something new, namely what it's like to see colors, or what it's like to have color experience. So there's something about color experience she didn't know. So what is that? That is the character, the qualitative character of a red experience. You just can't communicate that in the quantitative language of neuroscience. And I think that expressive limitation entails an explanatory limitation, right? If neuroscience was to explain the qualities of conscious experience, it would have to describe them, and it would then have to analyze them in physical terms. But if it can't even describe them, then it certainly can't give a reductive explanation of them.
And this generalizes to kind of all perception and experience, right? So we've talked about redness, and as if it's we're just talking about vision, but does this apply to the feeling of chair on my bum and the texture of does it apply to all of the senses and all of perception and experience in a way?
Yeah. I mean, so colors are given as just the most vivid example, perhaps. Actually, the Mary argument was published in 1982 by the philosopher Frank Jackson. And I was a bit sorry, in the same year, the philosopher Howard Robinson, a former colleague of mine, published a very similar argument, but with sounds rather than colors. And it's much less focused on, I always feel a bit, that's not fair. But anyway, so in principle, I think that the same argument applies to, tastes. If you've never tasted Marmite, you might wonder, I wonder what it's like to taste Marmite. And no matter how much you learn about the brain, you'll never know what it's like. And then you taste it and you go, that's what it's like.
Marmite can never be explained by neuroscience. Is that what you're saying?
That's what it all comes down to ultimately. But I mean,
therefore, physicalism is wrong.
Yes.
This is it. The Marmite argument against physicalism. It works.
But I think the way to put it actually is that there's information that's missing from any purely quantitative description. There's information about the qualities, and that's information about reality, right? The qualities are part of reality. They may be just in experience, but experience is part of reality. So if we want a complete theory of reality, we need to capture everything, including the qualities, the subjective qualities we find in experience. And you just can't do that with a purely quantitative vocabulary.
Okay, so you can't describe phenomenal properties with the sciences, with neuroscience or physics, or is that right?
That's the thought, yeah.
You can't describe
so phenomenal properties, I guess, is the philosophical jargon for these qualities we find in our experience, yeah.
And that's what you're talking about when you're talking about consciousness, is that right?
Yeah, I want to emphasize that that's never what physical science was designed for. So people have this idea, they kind of find these arguments a bit plausible, but then they think, oh, well, physical science has been so successful. Surely one day it'll crack the mystery of consciousness. But, actually, physical science, and Galileo was quite explicit about this. Physical science starts with Galileo saying, forget about those qualities. They're just in the soul. They're outside of the domain of science. Let's just focus on the quantitative aspects of matter. Now, the fact that limited project describing the quantitative features of matter, the fact that limited project has gone very well doesn't give us grounds, I don't think, for thinking, oh, well, that means physical science can get the qualities as well. It's gone so well precisely because it was premised on ignoring the qualities and just focusing on the quantities. So I think if Galileo time traveled to the present day and heard about this hard problem of consciousness, this problem of explaining consciousness in physical terms, he'd say, of course you can't do that. I designed physical science to deal with quantities, not qualities.
This is part of your argument that I genuinely find quite fascinating and strange. So I should probably mention, I don't know if you mentioned the title of your book that's going to be out next year, but it's called Galileo's Error, isn't it?
Yeah. And then a manifesto for a new science of consciousness. But yeah, wow. Galileo's Error is the main bit.
So I guess why don't you explain? You've touched on it already, but why don't you explain what the error was that Galileo made and why it's so profoundly important in your view?
So I think a crucial moment in the scientific revolution was Galileo's declaration. I mean, let's back up a little bit. I think people think, oh, the scientific revolution was all about thinking, oh, I know, let's do experiments. So before it was philosophers just thinking about stuff, and then Galileo comes along and says, oh, let's observe the world through telescopes or something. Of course, the development of the experimental method was crucial, but people forget the philosophical underpinnings of the scientific revolution. So this involved Galileo's declaration that mathematics was to be the language of the new science. So why had this never happened before? Why had people not thought before that, we can completely describe reality in mathematics? Well, because before Galileo, people thought the world is full of these qualities. There's colors on the surfaces of objects and smells floating through the air and tastes in food. And, it doesn't seem that you can capture those qualities in the purely quantitative vocabulary of physical science. So what did Galileo do? He philosophized and he thought, well, I don't think those qualities are really out there. I think they're in the soul. So colors aren't really on the surfaces of objects. Tastes aren't really in food. They're just in the soul of the person eating or perceiving. So the result of this is by stripping the qualities out of the physical world, we get a world that can be completely described in geometrical mathematics, a world with just shape and size and movement. So this is the birth of mathematical physics. But crucially, Galileo only took it to be a partial description of reality. So he hoped that in a mathematical language, we can capture the quantitative features of matter, but he didn't dream that it could capture the qualities of consciousness. And so actually the problem of consciousness is built into the way Galileo designed physical science, right? He designed physical science in such a way that consciousness as a qualitative phenomenon is essentially and inevitably mysterious, outside of the physical domain. And that's what we're discovering, which was always really there from the start.
So it could have been different. He could have set things up differently, or are you saying that?
I mean, it's obviously that limited project. So the way Galileo designed physical science, that project has gone incredibly well. I mean, roughly, I think the project of constructing mathematical models to capture the behavior of matter, that's gone incredibly well. And now, as the decades and centuries have gone on, we'd now have rich understanding of the causal structure of matter. But it was never intended to be a complete description of reality. It's necessarily an incomplete conception of science, because as Galileo sets things up, and then Descartes following Galileo, consciousness is outside of the domain of science. So I think what we need to do if we want a complete theory of reality is we need to move to a more expansive conception of science. So it's not about getting rid of physical science or telling physical scientists they're doing their job wrong. Physical science is great. It's aimed at capturing the behavior of matter, and it does that very well. But if we want a complete theory of reality, we need to move to a more expansive conception of science. This is what I sometimes call the post-Galilean science, where you take both the quantitative data of observation and experiment and the qualitative reality of consciousness that we all know from our own case, and you try to account for both of them.
Okay, so aren't neuroscientists doing that when they investigate people's experiences and then investigate what's happening in their brain? Aren't they doing almost exactly what you've described?
So I think what we get from neuroscience are correlations, right? Rich information about correlations. So we can find that, when such and such goes on in the brain, people have such and such experience, and vice versa. That's just the start, because what we ultimately want from a science of consciousness is to explain those correlations. Why is it that when people have such and such going on in their brain, they feel hunger or pain? Or what's the connection? And that's just the start. And that's where we get into the theories. And, the dualist has one answer, the materialist has another, the panpsychist has another. And we just have to assess them and see which is the most plausible account. So, people have this idea that neuroscience supports materialism or physicalism. But, the neuroscience is neutral. The neuroscience just gives us correlations, and then we need to theorize.
That's a really interesting point. I think a lot of people would find that quite counterintuitive. The idea that neuroscience is somehow neutral on, it doesn't adjudicate between materialism or dualism. Can you just explain again why that's the case? I guess you've covered it in that neuroscience uncovers correlations. So certain kinds of brain activity are correlated with certain kinds of experience. It might be that the brain activity causes the experience, which seems the most obvious to me. That seems the most obvious explanation. Or it might be that the brain activity just co-occurs with the experience.
Well, you said that what seems most natural to you is that the brain activity causes the experience, but that's the dualist position. That's what the dualist says.
Okay.
That's David Sharma's position.
Oops.
This is why, it's we always slip back into dualist ways of thinking. That we think that the materialist position is that the brain activity causes the feelings and experiences. That's dualism. If it causes it, then effects are distinct from their causes. I am distinct from my parents. They caused me to exist. So the materialist position is, the feelings and experiences are the brain states. They're one and the same thing. So neuroscience gives us correlations, and then you have to theorize about them. The dualist says, David Sharma as a dualist will say, well, that means the brain activity causes the consciousness in virtue of the special psychophysical laws of nature. The materialist will say, well, no, the brain activity just is the experiences.
So I want to go back into this material that has been rediscovered from Bertrand Russell and Eddington. It was really surprising to me, this idea that, and I quote you, that physics has revealed nothing to us about the nature of stuff.
Yeah.
Now, that's quite a surprising claim. I did slightly paraphrase and leave out some jargon there. But what can you possibly mean that physics has revealed nothing to us about the nature of stuff? And what's Bertrand Russell got to do with this?
Yeah, so this is hard to absorb. I guess in the public mind, physics is giving us this complete description of the nature of space, time, and matter, and this complete story of what physical reality is. But I think what Russell and Eddington realized is that actually it becomes apparent upon reflection that physical science only really tells us what stuff does. So if you think about what physics tells us about an electron, tells us an electron has mass and charge. How are these properties characterized? Mass is characterized in terms of attraction, gravitational attraction, and resistance to acceleration. Charge is characterized in terms of attraction and repulsion. These all concern what the electron does. So physics isn't interested in how the electron is in itself, what philosophers like to call its intrinsic nature. They just care about what it does. That's the really useful bit, And actually, Stephen Hawking, in a way, in the final page of the Brief History of Time, maybe captures, he says that, even if we one day get a grand unified theory, it will just be a bunch of equations and it won't tell us what breathes fire into the equations. This is one way of understanding what Russell and Eddington were getting at. Physics gives us these mathematical models that tell us what stuff does, but it has no interest. It has no concern with what stuff is, what it is that's doing that stuff.
That sounds completely beguiling, but also I guess the thought is, well, is there anything more to it than what stuff does? So so this table in front of us, we can knock it, we can touch it, we can saw it, we can burn it, we can do lots of stuff to it, and that feels like it tells us lots of information about the structure, the properties, the appearance of the table. But you're telling us that any of the physical things we can do to it, any of the experiments we can do with this table, is somehow not telling us about its intrinsic nature. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, and because this goes all the way up the physical sciences, in chemistry, things are characterized in terms of the causal relationships between chemical elements, for example, and in terms of the atomic constituents. And then in physics, as we've already discussed, we just learn about what stuff does. So actually, you feel like you're learning something when you learn that, water is composed of H2O molecules. But actually, when you cash that out in terms of physics, the physical components, and then you see, actually, well, physics just tells us what stuff does. You realize, actually, all we're learning about all the way up the physical hierarchy of sciences is behavior, what stuff does. And, that's not to trivialize it. This is crucial, important, very useful information. But yeah, it doesn't tell us anything beyond behavior.
So what else is there? And how on earth do you figure out what it is? So what this intrinsic nature, this mysterious intrinsic nature, I'm worried it's a invention of philosophers. I guess the suspicion is this an invention of philosophers to keep them in business so they can write papers about the intrinsic nature of stuff that has no causal interaction with anything, so we can't investigate what it is in the normal way that science investigates anything. Right. So what is it, and how do we draw conclusions about it?
Well, so one way you can take this is a kind of skeptical position where we just don't know the intrinsic nature of matter. And this is one way of understanding Kant's view is we can never get at reality as it is in and of itself. What Russell and Eddington said was, so is there anything we know about the intrinsic nature of matter? And they said, well, there is one thing. Some of it, namely the stuff in living brains, has a consciousness involving intrinsic nature. You are immediately aware of your own feelings and experiences. And assuming dualism is false, what you're aware of is the intrinsic nature of your own living brain. So this is what Russell said, this is the one window we have onto the intrinsic nature of the universe. So, and this insight turns the problem of consciousness on its head, right? So the problem of consciousness is usually thought of as, we really know a lot about the brain through neuroscience. But then there's this mysterious thing, consciousness. How on earth does consciousness fit in? But actually, it's, according to Russell and Eddington, it's completely the other way around. Consciousness is the one bit of physical reality we really understand. We really understand the intrinsic nature of. It's the rest that we're completely in the dark about. And so we really need to build up our understanding of the brain around our understanding of consciousness.
So consciousness is in the intrinsic nature of all stuff, of all matter. That's the hypothesis that you're...
That's the way Eddington interpreted it. But yeah, that's the way Eddington takes it, and the way I would want to take it. So the view is that there's just matter. There's just matter, just physical properties, nothing supernatural or spiritual. This is a radically non-dualistic theory of reality. Physical science describes it, as it were, from the outside, tells us what it does, how it behaves, but its intrinsic nature is constituted of consciousness. So this is a wonderfully simple, parsimonious way of integrating consciousness into our scientific story of the world, and in a way that, unlike dualism, is completely consistent with everything science tells us.
This is perhaps a silly question, but why is this just not another kind of dualism? So you're positing a new sort of fundamental thing, which is consciousness, and that's somehow in the nature of all matter. Have you not just sort of redefined dualism by saying, yes, consciousness is something different to the causal physical structure of the world, but it's somehow inside the causal physical structure of the world? We just can't ever prove that, but it seems likely. Isn't that just a kind of dualism?
David Chalmers has a nice line for this view. He says it fits the letter of materialism, but the spirit of dualism. I think that kind of gets it. So yes, in the sense that it's taking consciousness as a kind of primitive. It's not trying to explain consciousness in terms of something else. It's similar to dualism in that sense, but it avoids the problems of classical dualism. The problems of dualism are that these problems of interaction, the problems How do we make sense of the interaction between something non-physical consciousness and the physical brain? Why doesn't the impact of non-physical consciousness show up in the brain? This Russell Eddington panpsychism completely avoids all of those problems because consciousness is the intrinsic nature of the brain. It's not outside of the brain. So it's radically non-dualistic. When you first hear about panpsychism, you have the view that the electron has its physical properties like mass, spin, and charge, and its consciousness properties. That would be a kind of dualism. That's not the view. The view is there are just physical properties like mass and charge. They are themselves forms of consciousness. So physics describes them from the outside, tells us what they do, but they are forms of consciousness.
That's interesting. Okay, so mass is a form of consciousness.
That's right. Yeah, that's the view.
Wow. Okay. Now I hadn't understood that.
Yeah. So you said a moment ago that this stuff is sort of unobservable or doesn't cause anything, but I think that's quite right. It's the idea that this is just what physical stuff is. It's not, there's just physical stuff. There's mass, spin, charge. That's all that, once you've named those properties, there's only the things physics talks about, but physics doesn't tell us what they are. You might think this isn't, you usually think, this sounds like a very indulgent, extravagant hypothesis. But look, I think we know consciousness exists. Nothing is more evident than the reality of our feelings and experiences. The reality of consciousness is hard data. So if you've got people talk about the grand unified theory of everything that we aim for as scientists. If you've one day got a theory that can account for all the data of observation and experiments, but can't account for the reality of consciousness, your theory is thereby falsified because you've missed something out that's real. So there's hard data here that we need to account for. This is a proposal that accounts for it, that gives us a way of integrating this real natural phenomenon into our scientific story of the world in a way that's completely consistent with everything we know scientifically and doesn't postulate anything outside of the physical world we already believe in. What's wrong with that? Everyone's a winner.
Great. Well, that's a stirring speech there. I think I
went on a bit.
I guess I'm interested in finding out a bit about what some of your contemporaries and colleagues think of this idea. And I know that you went on this extraordinary sort of it was sort of a conference on a boat organized by a Russian millionaire, right?
Yeah, so this is organized by Dmitry Volkov, who's an investor, but also the founder of the Moscow Center for Consciousness. Yeah, he wanted to spend some money on, this was 10 philosophers on a sailing ship in the Arctic and 12 graduate students from Moscow University, a week traveling around talking about free will and consciousness. So we had talks and discussions on the boat and then stopping at uninhabited islands along the way, and so most of the passengers were people who, like Dennett, come very close to thinking that consciousness just doesn't exist. Who perhaps agree with the arguments I've just been expounding, that consciousness, in the sense I'm thinking of it, doesn't fit into our scientific picture. But they conclude from that, I conclude from that we need to move to a more expansive conception of science. They conclude that, consciousness doesn't exist. It's like fairies or magic or something. So most of the participants were on that side of the debate. But I guess at some point they thought, we need some opposition. So myself as the panpsychist and David Chalmers and Martina Niederrümelin as the dualists were the official onboard opposition. So, we had some pretty fearsome debates.
Yes, well, I know you did, because you can watch some of them on YouTube. And I watched your presentation and the kind of quite fierce critical exchange afterwards, and also David Chalmers. And David Chalmers is extraordinary because he's pacing back and forth on this boat, and people are firing quite trenchant objections to his position, and he's talking so fast, and it's very exciting. You feel like you're right at the cutting edge. You're the coal face of philosophers doing philosophy with each other, and they're merciless. Yeah,
it does get a bit intense. But I guess that's the way you hone ideas, with kind of rigorous interrogation, and sometimes you feel like with some philosophers, I won't mention any names, no one on board that ship. She's just playing games. It's these kind of manly jousting, and that's unfortunate and problematic in lots of ways. But as long as it's done in a respectful way, I think this is the way to work things out, by rigorous interrogation of ideas. So yeah, I love giving a talk to people can find out the problems for me, and then I can iron them out. And I remember watching David Chalmers talk actually, and I think I was slightly drunk in the back. And
I think he might have been slightly drunk.
Yeah, I had actually my proudest philosophical moment. One of my proudest philosophical moments at that boat. I managed to persuade Daniel Dennett he was wrong.
About what?
Not about his whole worldview, obviously, but a pretty significant thing. It's this issue of whether dualism is consistent with the principle of conservation of energy.
Ooh, okay.
So,
God, that sounds clever.
A little bit.
Well, it's interesting to me, but I mean, I might cut it out, but I don't.
Okay,
that sounds brilliant.
So Dennett, in his book Consciousness Explained, and Paul Churchland as well, have argued that dualism is ruled out by the principle of conservation of energy. So this principle that energy in a closed system is neither created nor destroyed. So the idea is, if the soul was, or the immaterial mind was impacting on the brain, then that would add energy to the physical world. So this is inconsistent with the principle of conservation. So what I suggested, this was actually in Paul Churchland's talk. So as I pointed out, I don't think this is a problem for the dualist. I mean, I'm not a dualist, and I think dualism is problematic, but I don't think it's problematic for this reason, because, I mean, as I've already discussed, David Chalmers, as a dualist, thinks there are these psychophysical laws of nature relating the mental and the physical. And it seems to me they could just say those laws respect conservation of energy. I mean, after all, in our current scientific picture, there are multiple laws of nature that all work together to respect conservation of energy. So the dualist could say, well, there's just these other ones. And it just got this huge reaction. One of the graduate students later said, they turned on you like a pack of wolves. And everyone was like, oh, so you believe in magic. And I was just like, I'm just trying to make this very specific point. So we had a quite fearsome exchange. But then later, everyone went off to an island in the evening, but I stayed on board. I went on deck, and Dan Dennett was carving a walking stick on the deck. He's very hands-on kind of guy. Anyway, I just honed down on this point. I just kept honing down this very specific point. I'm not saying dualism is plausible. I'm not saying there's any reason to believe it, but it's consistent with conservation of energy. And in the end, he said, yeah, maybe that's right. I said, yes.
That's pretty awesome.
So I went to bed.
Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty awesome achievement to have convinced Daniel Dennett of something.
I can die a happy man.
Very exciting. So I wanted to ask you about the sort of broader, perhaps religious or spiritual resonances of panpsychism. Now, as far as I understand it, your claim is not a religious one. No. But it seems to have, certainly historically, a panpsychist view has been associated with a religious one. And I mean, there's something rather beguiling about the idea that consciousness or mind is part of the intrinsic nature of matter, and that maybe the universe and everything is sort of full of consciousness in some sense, right? Has it struck people as having a sort of religious tone to it?
Yeah, I mean, there are those cultural associations. I mean, I'd want to emphasize that the motivations for panpsychism, at least as I understand it, are nothing to do with anything spiritual or theological. This is most of the people defending this are complete atheists, defending it as just cold-blooded, naturalistic, best account of this natural phenomenon of consciousness that we know to be part of the natural world. Having said that, though, I can see that if for independent reasons you have spiritual beliefs, I can see that probably a panpsychist worldview would be more consonant with those than say a materialistic worldview. And I guess I'm inclined to think panpsychism. Yeah, I'm inclined to think that probably panpsychism as a worldview is a little bit better for our spiritual health than, say, materialism. I mean, materialism is pretty dismal. It's sort of, you've got a kind of essentially mechanistic view of the natural world, and then you've got the sort of immensity of cold, empty space. It's pretty bleak. Whereas if you're a panpsychist, we're conscious creatures in a conscious universe. This is, a worldview in which we can feel a little bit more at home, a little bit more comfortable in our own skin. But, it's crucial to emphasize, that doesn't give us any reason to believe it, right? We should be looking for the view that's most likely to be true, not the view we'd like to be true.
Yes.
However, I'm inclined to think that we do have reason to believe it for cold-blooded scientific reasons of explaining consciousness, but it's a slightly nicer picture of the world, I think.
It is, but didn't you at one point in an article in Eon argue that one reasonable and motivated version of panpsychism is cosmopanpsychism, which is the idea that the universe is a kind of huge mind that somehow has tinkered with itself in order to enable the emergence of conscious
you've been doing
beings.
your homework.
That is a hugely spiritual view. The idea that the universe is a mind that sort of encourages, by tinkering with the fundamental laws of physics or the fundamental forces of physics, enabled kind of deliberately the emergence of beings with a complex consciousness like us. That's...
Philosophers like to try out views, and I maybe should have made it clearer in the context of this popular article that, I'm just sort of exploring a view, test, and I think that's, we shouldn't be afraid to try out possibilities and explore possibilities. And I do think there is something intriguing and puzzling about. I was starting this off as a discussion of the so-called fine-tuning of the laws of nature. This surprising discovery of the last 30 or 40 years that, against incredible odds, the physicists tell us, many of the numbers in basic physics are exactly as they need to be for life to be possible. Things have been very slightly different in all sorts of ways. Life would not be possible. So I think this is, people, just try to sort of dismiss this in all sorts of questionable ways. I think, there's clearly something intriguing here. But of course, there are a couple of explanations, right? Some people try to explain it in terms of God. Others try to explain it in terms of the multiverse hypothesis, that there are a huge, perhaps infinite number of different universes, all with slightly different numbers in their basic physics. And so it becomes statistically inevitable that you're going to have a universe right for life. So, you get the theist saying, oh, it's obviously God, and the atheist saying, oh, well, it's obviously the multiverse. And, to my mind, these both sound like pretty extraordinary hypotheses. It's, one should be fairly agnostic either way, I think. And so I'm probably actually these days, as I've written, slightly more inclined to the multiverse hypothesis of the quantum mechanical version seems to me, for various technical reasons, to avoid problems that other versions, more familiar versions of multiverse face. But I think it's at this stage we don't know either way, and people are just clinging one way or the other for sort of ideological reasons, rather than just being genuinely open to what the best explanation is. So what I was trying to do in that article, I suppose, was try out a third option that has less metaphysical extravagance than either a supernatural God or the multiverse hypothesis. And I'm not ashamed to have tried out that idea. But although at the moment I'm probably a little bit more back in the multiverse camp. But
okay, well, it was an intoxicating idea to explore, certainly.
I do think we're supposed to be open-minded and looking at the evidence. Whereas, if you look at sort of Richard Dawkins, actually in the God Delusion has an a priori philosophical argument why God is not a good explanation of this, and it's also a really bad philosophical argument. I think there's too much ideology in both directions. I think people are so polarized, and I think the atheists like to feel that the religious people are just stuck in the past and we've moved on and we've got some certainty, and the theists like to think the atheists are in denial. And I think there's too much ideology in both directions, and we should just be. The true spirit of the Enlightenment is sort of open-mindedness about what theory of the universe might turn out to be true.
You closed your last book with the sentence that a true post-Galilean metaphysics hasn't yet begun. So what's next? What's next in the research program of panpsychism?
I think so much has changed in the science of consciousness. It used to be a taboo topic even to talk about consciousness as a scientific subject. It's now seen as a serious issue, as the hard problem of consciousness. But I think still people think of it as just a problem that'll go away if we just do a bit more neuroscience. So I think the next stage is to see consciousness as a datum in its own right, on a par with the data of observation and experiment. So that's what I call the post-Galilean science. And I think what the Russell Eddington insight offers us is a way forward, but it's very schematic, and it will require decades or centuries of interdisciplinary work to fill in the details. So that's partly what I'm doing with a popular book, trying to get this out to a broader audience. It's getting much more known and respected in academic philosophy, but it's still completely unknown outside of the ivory tower of academic philosophy. So I think we really need to go on with this. Just as, Darwinism was an insight, the principle of natural selection, that could begin a research program, and then it takes, a century to get to DNA. Similarly, I think this Russell Eddington insight points the way to a research program, but that research program hasn't really begun, and it will take a long time to fill in the details.
Exciting. Very exciting.
Yeah.
Philip Goff, thank you for speaking with me.
That's all right. Thanks for having me. It was really fun.